Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to InfoGamer. Hope you're having a wonderful day. We're finally done with going through the logistics of setting up Unity and talking about the different standard windows that make up your workstation. So we can finally start getting our hands dirty and talk about the more interesting things that Unity has to offer, like game objects and components. Now for this lesson, we want to talk about game objects. We're going to explain what they are, what they're used for, and we're going to demonstrate how they're used in Unity. So to start with, I want to give you a simple definition of what a game object is. Now, a game object inside of Unity is the most simple unit or structure that we use and start with to create every element and every feature found inside the environment of our video game. So whether it is a character inside your video game that a player is controlling, such as Mario or Link or even Master Chief, or if it's an item pickup like a gun, a sword, or a mushroom, or even just the platforms that your levels are created from, all of these items inside your video game are made from game objects. Everything inside the scene and the hierarchy of your video game is a game object itself. So from this information, we can tell that game objects are super important, and we're going to learn more about them. So here we have our tutorial project open inside of Unity, and I'm going to start with showing you how to create a game object to begin with. Now, the simplest form of a game object is what's called an empty game object. And to create an empty game object, we're going to go to the game object drop-down menu at the top and find Create Empty. You can also create an empty game object by selecting the Create drop-down menu inside your hierarchy and then select Create Empty. Once you have your empty game object created, you can see within your hierarchy that there's a new item listed, and it has the name of game object. So now we have three items listed in our hierarchy. We have the main camera, the directional light, and the empty game object. These first two items are default items that come with every scene that you create. And this empty game object is the one that we just created. Now it's important to note that any item that will be listed inside your hierarchy that's not a category is a game object. Now currently, when I have our new empty game object selected inside our hierarchy window, you can see within our scene view that this transform tool appears. Now this transform tool we'll talk more about in the next video when we talk about the transform component of game objects. Now if I were to deselect our new empty game object within the hierarchy window, you'll see within the scene view that there's no evidence that we have any game objects contained inside our scene. That's because with an empty game object, there's no visual components attached to our game object to indicate that there is anything there. And there's also no possible way of selecting our new empty game object within the scene view. However, we can still select our empty game object within the hierarchy view, and when we do so, you'll see that the transform tool appears inside the scene, and this transform tool indicates where in our scene this empty game object is located. But let's go on to discuss the various attributes that make up the structure of a game object, and we'll do this by looking in the inspector window as we have our empty game object selected in the hierarchy. So the first thing that you might notice inside the inspector is this little icon here that looks like a cube with a blue, a green, and a red face. Now this icon is a drop-down menu where you can assign a visual gizmo to your game object. That way in your scene view you can see where your game object is located. So if I were to select this blue bar icon, you'll see how in the scene view we can now see the location of our game object. And you can see how we have the name of our game object displayed inside the icon. Having a visual icon assigned to your game object allows you to also select game objects in your scene view. So I can now select our empty game object from our scene view as well as the hierarchy. This is a helpful feature when it comes to objects that don't normally have any visual component to them, such as spawn points or game objects that have game controlling scripts attached to them. Moving on to the next option for game objects inside the inspector, you'll see this checkbox to the left of the name of your game object. Now this checkbox allows you to turn on and off the activeness of your game object inside the hierarchy. So if I were to uncheck this box, you'll see how in the scene view the visual gizmo assigned to our game object has disappeared, and inside the hierarchy, the name of our object is a faded color. So an example from my own personal experience, I tend to use this feature of turning on and off objects inside your scene when it comes to menu systems. So let's say we have a menu system that's made up of multiple panels or pages, and you want to transition from one panel to another panel by clicking a button. Say you click a settings button and you want it to take you to a settings page where you can modify settings inside your video game. Well, you would then create a script that on the click of this button turns off the current panel and turns on the panel for settings. Now the next option available to us inside the inspector is the name of the game object. So we have this text field here, and it currently says game object, which is the name of our empty game object inside the hierarchy. Now I can change the name of my game object to really whatever I want. So I'm going to change the name of this game object to something like the name goes here. And then it's important to hit enter to set this name. And once I hit enter, you can see how the name has now changed inside the hierarchy, and as well the name listed on the visual icon for our game object. Now another way to change the name of your game objects is to select them in the hierarchy and then click on the object once more inside the hierarchy. This is similar to like editing files in your Explorer. Now I can then just rename this to whatever I want and hit enter, and that should save the name as well. Now it's important to make sure that you name your game objects with names that you'll be able to remember. It'll also help you keep your hierarchy organized. The next option is another checkbox next to where it says static. This is also a drop-down menu where you can set different aspects of a game object to be static. Most of the time I use setting an object to be static when it comes to baking the lighting of my environment. So for example, if you have a landscape that doesn't move and is always going to be in a certain location and you need to bake the lighting for that landscape, you can set the object to static, and it will make it so that the reflections of those objects are baked into the lighting. The next option is a drop-down menu next to where it says tag. This is where you get to select the tag for your game object. Now tags are super helpful because it allows you to identify objects as a certain category or classification. So let's say you have 10 different enemies, but each of those enemies have different names, and so to identify the enemies as an enemy based on its name would be really complex because there's 10 of them. And so you can set the tag of these 10 different enemies as enemy, and that makes it a lot easier to identify all 10 different objects as enemies even though their names are different. The next option is another drop-down menu next to where it says layer. This allows you to set the layer of an object, and what layers do is they allow you to set which objects and layers interact with each other and which ones don't. Now a recent example I have of working with layers in my own experience was I was developing a VR application and I wanted to be able to interact with a certain game object using raycasts, but I didn't want the colliders of my player to run into the object. I wanted to be able to pass through the object so I could see inside it. And so what I did was I set the object on one layer and I set the player object on another layer, and I made it so those layers don't interact with each other, but then I made the object layer be able to interact with raycasts. Now these are all the options available to us in the inspector when it comes to the game object class or structure. Another component inside the inspector that we can see is the transform component. Now every single game object that you'll ever create inside your hierarchy has a transform component. Now it's important to note that the game object class or structure is a different class than the transform class, but a game object will always have a transform connected to it. Now the last thing that I want to mention, and we mentioned this in the inspector video, is how to add components to a game object. So right now at the moment, we just have an empty game object, and there's nothing really interesting about an empty game object. Now, empty game objects are important because we can use them for the basis of its transform, getting a specific position or rotation or scale inside the environment of our scene. But in order to create a video game, we need a lot more than just empty game objects. So in order to customize your game objects, you're going to want to know how to add components. So we can use this Add Component button to select from a drop-down menu a number of different components, and all of these different components are categorized. Now there is a search option, so if you know exactly which component you want to add to your game object, you can just type it in. So say I want like a mesh collider, then I could type in mesh and then select mesh or mesh filter or mesh render and so on. Then I would select the physics category, and here at the top you can see rigid body. I would then click on this component, and here in the inspector you can see that we now have a rigid body component attached to our empty game object, which means that our empty game object is no longer an empty game object. Now over the next few videos, we'll talk about all the different components that are available inside of Unity. But for now, you know how to add components to your game objects inside the inspector. Now that's everything that we wanted to talk about in this lesson about game objects. We hope you were able to follow along and that everything made sense. If you have any questions regarding game objects, you can leave them in the comments below. Make sure that you like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can get regular notifications when we release new videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.